So this is what we're talking about this evening, Dr. Santin. Is this document here worth saving? That's our question.
Yes.
Sure. So my name is John Nunes, but I am known on campus as Mr. Mo, which is not really an insult. It's a blessing to be Mr. Mo. And so I'm Monique's husband, who everyone knows. And I work as a pastor in Santa Monica, California.
And I am Professor Brian Santin. I teach in the English department here and in the History and Political Thought department. I teach the Constitution class here as well. I live on campus at the Polis Plaza LLC with my son and or with my wife and my 3-year-old son. His birthday is today. He's turning 3 today. And
hence fits on the sock.
I have some, this was a gift from my grandparents. They monogrammed some socks with his face on it. So I'm wearing his face on my socks today.
Wearing fits.
And so the question we're asking today is the Constitution worth saving? We're not talking about worth saving simply in a past sense, not talking simply about the founding. We're talking about, is the Constitution worth saving today? Does it work today? Or do we need a new constitutional convention? Do we need something else? Do we need some changes that are so radical that the amendment process wouldn't work? Like, we need something more serious, more severe than something like the amendment process. Is a Constitution worth saving in its current formation? And we're going to look at 3 issues in relation to that, and we called them the 3 R's: race, representation, and religion. So I think we need a coin.
So the format will be in each of these topics. We're going to use a coin to flip. Thank you very much. And is there a student who would like to be our official coin tosser?
Somebody.
Ethan, I trust you, Ethan. Thank you very much. And so one moment. Okay, so we'll call heads or tails, pro or con, with each question. In other words, with respect to race, is the Constitution worth saving? Or because of racial injustice in the United States of America and its legacy and history, do we need to rework or rewrite the Constitution? That's the question. And so what we're going to do with each of those questions, so the second one is representation, and then the third is religion, is whoever picks the coin and wins the toss starts with whatever side he chooses, and the other person is compelled to take the other side.
Yes.
And then we'll flip.
Yes.
At halfway through each topic. So we're going to go like just short of an hour. So let's say, 17 minutes for each topic. Would anyone like to be a timekeeper? Can we get a timekeeper? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. And at the 8.5 minute mark, if you can just kind of gently raise your hand, and that's when we'll kind of try to orchestrate the flip smoothly at that point. Does that work for you?
Yep.
Is that good?
Sounds good.
Okay. All right, so you can be the first. You can call it first.
Okay.
So let's say
Ethan
is pro.
Okay. If go ahead and I'll call heads pro. Okay. So I will say that the Constitution is worth saving in relation to race, and you will say it is not.
Correct.
Would you? I got the start. So would you
win?
You want me? Okay.
Start. Yeah.
All right. So why is the Constitution worth saving when considering the history of racial injustice in America? Well, the first thing that I usually point out when I teach my U.S. Constitution course, and these are the 3 books that we use. This is a textbook here that goes through the entire constitutional history of the U.S. up through the 21st century. This is the Great Debate. So this is the ratification debate. And then this is a close reading of the Constitution the entire Constitution and the entire Declaration of Independence with annotations from a leading scholar named Jack Rakoff. And one of the things that these books point out is that if you look at the convention in 1787 and the ratification in 1788, if you look forward to the 21st century, if that is where your vision is cast, then there is no doubt that the Constitution is a racist document. It enshrines slavery. It enshrines a society of domination.
Making my point or your point?
No. Okay. It makes a society. It is a society of domination from a 21st century perspective. But okay, now if you look backwards, now look at what the founders have at their disposal. Looking at ancient Greece, ancient Rome, the various European wars. As Michael Benedict says right here in this book, the Constitution, up until that point in history, is the most democratic document that human beings have ever put together, he says. Well, why is that? One, there's no property qualification for holding office. That's revolutionary. There is no king. There is actually no titles of nobility. The word nobility comes up twice in the US Constitution. And both times it says that no titles of nobility can be granted, right? Also, there is no religious test for elected officials. So you look at that and you look at what has come before it. It is a document of radical emancipation. And look at who has used that document moving forward, taking those values and principles, right? Frederick Douglass, right? Escaped enslaved person, saying that the Constitution is a document of liberty. Look at Martin Luther King Jr. Look at later people who understood what the principles and values were when it was adopted and carried those principles through history. That'd be my opening statement.
That's outstanding. I agree with you wholeheartedly that if, which is what you said, I think, you're looking back, then the Constitution is better than the US Constitution of 1789 is better than anything we had seen up until that point. However, we're not looking back. We're living in 2023, 240 years after the Constitution, okay? So we have to consider the time in which we find ourselves. Let's take a look at who wrote the United States Constitution. We have males, all males. We have white males, all white males. We have white males who don't even need to work. They have so much money, they don't even need to work. These are white men who have no room and no place in their worldview for people of color, for Native Americans who were treated grotesquely unjustly at that time, for slaves. In fact, they knew slavery was wrong, which is disgusting to me, because they refused to even put the word slavery into the Constitution because they knew it was wrong. They all kind of say, well, we know it's wrong, but we'll go along with a compromise just in order to get the deal done. Women were not permitted to vote at the time of their framing. So we can see quite clearly what their worldview is. And it's impossible for me to imagine that men with a worldview like that did not bake into the Constitution categories and structures that precluded people from participation in the American experiment. Let's take a look at where we are now. Mass incarceration rates, 5 times greater for African Americans than for whites. Unemployment rates, twice the number for Blacks than whites. Salary for the same job, 24% lower for African Americans. That's got to come from somewhere. In my opinion, that comes from the way we were founded. So what we need to do is we need to go back to the drawing board and figure it out so we can create a society that is just with equality for all people. That's what they said they believed in.
Some interesting points there.
Just interesting?
Just interesting.
You're not compelled by those?
I am not. I am not compelled.
It doesn't bother you? Mass incarceration doesn't bother you?
Mass incarceration.
Injustice doesn't bother you?
Is epiphenomenal after the Constitution. It is not as if the Constitution produces mass incarceration.
It doesn't produce it, but it totally sets up a system that ends up with those kind of results. It should not be shocking to us that we are where we are.
It sets up the Constitution sets up an unjust system. It preserves slavery. However, the Declaration of Independence, which is kind of the poetry of power, and the Constitution, which is kind of the grammar of power, those two things give us a set of principles and standards. So, for instance, Ralph Ellison, the famous Black writer, in his novel Invisible Man, famously says, "You can yes them to death." And what the narrator means by that is just because the founders didn't necessarily respect the values that they themselves put in place, or they didn't understand them, doesn't mean that those values cannot be used to produce justice and equality. And the other thing is, my students talk about this all the time, we point this out in class, if you have a society that introduces the principles, then you have introduced rhetorical.
Which principles?
From the Declaration, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
How about the principle of 3/5 human, that or accounting for 3/5 of a person? So my mother is white, so she's like 5/5 of a person. My father is Black, so he's 3/5 of a person. What does that make me? 4/5 of a person? Is that the math? Is that the right math? That's still in that language is still there. I'm offended by that language is still there. Why can't we eliminate that language? We changed our constitution at my congregation that women can now vote in our congregation. Previously, women weren't permitted to vote. Guess what we did? We struck those lines out and got them out of the Constitution because we're embarrassed that we even had those in the Constitution. Why can't we get rid of that egregious language?
As you know, Dr. Nunes, as you know, the 3/5 compromise famously, and I have Constitution suits in here, the people who wanted enslaved people to be counted as full persons were the Southerners, because the 3/5 compromise is about representation. And the Northerners said we should not count the enslaved people at all, right? And now there is language at the time that today comes off as extremely racist, but it makes a very interesting point.
Is it racist or isn't it racist?
No,
it comes off as racist.
No, but here's the thing. Elbridge Gerry, for instance, says the South wants to count enslaved people because they want to increase their power in the House. They want more representatives. And Gerry says, we don't count our cattle and tools. But he says that in order to decrease the power of the slave power at the time.
So they're willing to engage in a compromise that diminishes the full humanity of persons just in order to get the deal done.
Absolutely.
And you're comfortable with that.
The question is not between a utopian solution in which slavery will no longer exist, because slavery was inherited in the colonies. We have enslaved people from the 1600s. And if you don't have a compromise, which sets up the possibility to abolish slavery, if you don't have a compromise, you're still going to have slavery in the colonies. You're still going to have slavery in the Articles of Confederation. And if we don't come together as a union, we're going to have slavery in probably some kind of confederated territories if we don't pass the U.S. Constitution.
You ready to flip?
Yes. Sometimes George Orwell has
my main line that I missed was "we the people" doesn't mean all the people. It's just some of the people, some of the time. That was
George Orwell famously says, sometimes if you have the mask on too long, it becomes your face.
Yeah.
And sometimes you find yourself getting carried away with your own arguments.
Yeah. So now I'm going to try to shift. I'm really just deeply disappointed with some of the things I heard you say, though. Like I'm hurt personally by that, but I'll move forward. Okay.
Please.
Let me tell you, this Constitution is the best document ever created in the history of humanity. I mean, do you know how revolutionary that phrase, "we the people," you know how revolutionary? This changes everything. Not we the king, not we the state, but we the people. It's phenomenal how they created these founders, these men. And they weren't speaking from their own kind of existential position in society. They were speaking to an Enlightenment tradition that held to a view of the human person that was aspirational. They knew the very fact that they admitted that slavery was wrong means that they knew, and they also knew that it was going to take some time to get there. Okay, so they build those provisions into the Constitution. In fact, they have that sunset clause, which you didn't mention.
I'll try to give you a chance.
The sunset clause, which says, okay, you know what? The importation of slaves, that can go on for 20 more years, but then we're done with this thing. The reason why this document has lasted 240 years, and it's been replicated by nation after nation, is because it's such an ingenious enshrining of the rights of the human person. And it builds in Article 5, this system of amendments so that we can find a way forward. We know that we're not a perfect union. They admit that, right? In the Constitution, they admit we're not a perfect, but we've got this way that we can move forward. So looking back from now to then, we can see the Reconstruction Amendments of 13, 14, 15, and then 19 for the right of women to vote. I mean, this is a nation that is getting better and better and better. And I like Bill Clinton, a Democrat, you know, who,
Okay.
Yeah, but I don't know, you know, Bill Clinton, in his first inaugural address, he makes this fabulous statement. I want to get his words exactly right. He says that there's nothing that's wrong about America that cannot be cured by what's right about America. And why is that the case? That is the case because of the United States Constitution.
Okay. Let me take the con position, tell you why the Constitution is a fatally flawed racist document. which is the Constitution a radical emancipatory document? Yes, for everybody, as John C. Calhoun, who was a vice president of the United States and the main defender of slavery, he wrote an article called Slavery as a Positive Good, right? He says, yeah, it is designed to be emancipatory if you are not Black. That is what he says. He says, for instance, in Europe, there is a nobility and there are peasants. Europe has a class-based oppressive system by design. He says, in America, if you are white, no matter if you are in the upper class or the lower class, you have status and you have dignity. If you are Black, you have no rights. And that cashes out. That becomes a prophetic statement. He says it in the 1840s. It becomes a prophetic statement in the Dred Scott case of 1857, if you're familiar with that. And in that case, it says that African Americans have no rights by which white men are bound to respect, right? None. How does that get adjudicated? Does it get adjudicated by this, magically utopian document called the Constitution? Do we go through constitutional processes to give African Americans rights? No, we have a giant war. And as most scholars will point out, most rights that are conceded to African Americans are done through violence and bloodshed, right? Look at the Civil War. Look at Reconstruction. Look at the Civil Rights Movement, right? The only time that African Americans get rights, as Malcolm X said, is when Black people are on their knees. And as Malcolm X also said, the idea that you're giving us rights, we are people of dignity and power. If you put a knife 8 inches into my back and you take it out only 2 inches, that's not justice, right? So the Constitution is not worth saving because the Constitution has never done what it has promised to do in relation to African Americans, and that is adjudicate conflicts, give them the rights that they deserve. All of the rights come through violence, and they come outside of the constitutional process.
The greatest movement to turn society around in the United States of America in its history was the Civil Rights Movement, which was a movement of nonviolent resistance. Martin King appeals to the Constitution over and over again, to the natural rights principles of people like John Locke and others who believed that there was an essential freedom and dignity that every single human person had. That was King's basic appeal. King's appeal was not to overturn the United States through some sort of revolution. King's appeal was to appeal to what's best and most noble in the lives of people in the United States of America. Without the Constitution, he would have been entirely unable to do. In fact, King says that if we fight a race war, it will be a bloodshed. You agreeing with me?
I agree with that.
Are you still in character or what?
No, I agree with that part.
So how's it fatally flawed? Those are your words.
Yes, it is fatally flawed.
So you disagree with King's appeal?
Yeah, I'm taking the radical side here. Like, I can't agree with the King. I'm taking this idea because why do we get the 1964 Civil Rights Act, right? There's a book by Mary Dudziak. She's a historian. It's called Cold War Civil Rights. And we have the archives, we have the phone calls from Lyndon Johnson, who is the president at the time, who signs the 1964 Civil Rights Act, who signs the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and who signs the 1968 Housing Rights. Okay, why does he do it? What does he say on tape? He says, because we are a country that says that we promise freedom and equality, and we definitely don't when it comes to African Americans. And we know it, and the world knows it. And it is being used by the Soviet Union. We're in the middle of the Cold War. This is the Cold War civil rights. It is being used by the Soviet Union for propaganda purposes. Every time you sick dogs on African American protesters, that's showing up on the front page of Pravda, which is the propaganda magazine in the Soviet Union at the time. They don't do it out of goodwill. They do it out of a geopolitical calculation.
Who cares what the intent or the will of the person who grants or obeys or follows the rule of law? Thank God there is a rule of law for him to follow. Who was Lyndon Baines Johnson citing when he said that we are a nation that has these principles? He's citing the framers and the founders. And so you're helping me to make my point. Thank you so very much. Is it time? 1 minute. Let's peel back the curtain.
Let's drop the mask.
So how do you feel about that side? That's a hard side to take, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think it is a hard side to take. It's the con side, especially because of how much racial progress there has been in the history of the country. But the key here is when you talk about racial disparities, it's hard to link that back to the U.S. Constitution.
But we have to take seriously the experience of people who are living those disparities.
Of course. But is that a problem with the Constitution?
It's not a problem with the Constitution.
Yeah,
but I think too often, like originalists and others who care about the Constitution don't take enough time, in my estimation, to actually listen to what the experience of people is in the U.S.
And I do think to take seriously the idea that a lot of civil rights advances of various kinds do come mostly through violence. Most times, African American, as Frederick Douglass says, power does not concede anything without a demand.
But Douglass himself is a constitutionalist.
Yeah.
So Douglass, who says, power is never surrendered, it has to be demanded, but he himself is a constitutionalist.
Yeah, I mean, the issue is the Constitution can, especially the principles and founding values, I think are of supreme importance. There is a moment of pause that so much of rights for different types of people have to come through violence. That is disturbing. Is the problem?
Yeah,
I don't think it invalidates the Constitution. I think the Constitution is worth saving in relation to race, but it is something to give you pause, right? It's not like most rights given to people who didn't have rights. Most of them did not come through peaceful means. It didn't come down from people sitting down and having a rational conversation,
including the American Revolution.
Including the American Revolution. Yeah.
Okay, so let's go to the second point, which is representation. So we're going to flip the coin again. You want to give it to another person this time? And I'll call heads again. And heads will be you want to, it's up to your call. I don't care where we start. It is heads? Is heads pro, you said?
Yeah.
What do you want heads to be, pro or con? Representation. Con, okay. Very good. Give me a moment.
Let's just define representation too. Like what do we mean?
You do that while I collect my con thoughts.
So we were thinking of race in a kind of specific way. That's like a specific racial ethnic group. We're thinking of the Constitution. Is it worth saving in relation to broader claims of representation? So we mentioned a little bit other groups, but women, Native Americans, immigrants. So is the Constitution a truly representative document, or is it representative enough to be saved, or do we need radical changes? That's basically the question.
Okay, very good. So while I, at heart felt that on racial grounds, the Constitution was worth saving, this one's a no-brainer for me. I mean, just ask yourself, do you feel represented? Do you feel heard? Do you feel like your opinion matters in the United States of America anymore? We are in such a mess as a nation. I mean, if you look at where the budget is, out of control spending, if you look at the bipartisan, the hyper-partisan, divided nature and character of life in the United States, I mean, there hasn't been an amendment to this Constitution in more than 50 years. Okay. Well, there was one in
the 90s.
Yeah, but that was from 1790 something. Okay, that one was finally adopted in 1992, but it was proposed in 1789. You actually told me about that, Joellen. Thank you. And so that doesn't count, does it?
Okay, I'll give you that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right. So in 50 years, so the whole system of getting amendments no longer works. I mean, it takes 2/3 of the states to the state legislatures to agree, and then it has to be 3/4 agreement at the end. It takes 2/3 up front to propose, and then 3/4 on the backside, and we can never get that threshold anymore in the United States. So, relying on amendments isn't going to do it. We need a constitutional convention where we can all come together, have a national conversation about what's broken in our political party system. Is the Electoral College. Who can explain the Electoral College? I don't understand. Do you understand the Electoral College? I don't get it. I can't understand how it works. We need a better system. I mean, the future that we are bequeathing to young people around our Social Security system and Medicaid, and we're running out of resources entirely. We've got to come together, not start all the way over again, but this current Constitution, with respect to representation, is no longer working. We have never been so divided as we are right now as a nation, blue states and red states. Well, we have been. 1860. And what happened? A civil war. And how much bloodshed did it take for us to fix the problem? I don't want to go that route. So I think a constitutional convention is what we need in order. I mean, there's nothing sacred about like this document. This is not like a Bible or a Quran. This is not a sacred document. Okay. And we had a constitution that it was the Articles of Confederation in 1776. Less than 10 years later, we realized this thing is not working. George Washington says, we don't have any money. We don't know what we're going to do. So we immediately call a constitutional convention. It's now 240 years later. Why can't we do it again?
Well, I agree with you about the hyperpartisanship, but that's not a problem with the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution is a result of what I would argue is a kind of Madisonian genius. So James Madison, often called the father of the Constitution, the main architect of the Constitution, says we need to put together a document in which people do the right things for the wrong reasons. He says that evil, that badness, that sin, he doesn't use the word sin, but that's what he basically means, that sin is sown into the nature of man. So we cannot rely on public virtue. We cannot rely on good politicians doing the right thing all the time. So he puts a system in place in order to anticipate that problem. And he says, okay, we're going to have checks and balances. We are going to have separation of powers. And the Constitution then becomes a kind of political technology. So think of the word technology not simply in a kind of contemporary digital sense, but think of technology in the ancient Greek sense of tekne as a way of doing things, as a kind of applied knowledge. That's what the Constitution is, political technology. And that political technology is designed to produce stable, very important word, stable change. not instability, not chaos, but stable change. And this is what the Constitution has done. The Constitution is a document that starts with we the people. If there is a problem with partisanship, it starts with us. If there is a problem with your elected leaders, if you don't like your elected leaders, then you should vote or try to persuade other people to vote for different leaders. The problem is not with the Constitution. It is with us, as George Washington, who was just here at noon, told us. He said, we give this to you. The leaders of this government are not elites. They are not rich white men. It is you. You are the ones who are voting for these people. And if you don't like politics, you need to look not at the Constitution, but in the mirror.
Let me ask you a question.
I practiced that line.
That was good. That was a stick. That was a stick-em line. Yeah. I didn't hear
I won't drop it. I
Yeah,
won't.
yeah,
I don't want
thanks.
to pay for it.
Okay. Look in the mirror. All right. Now look at me when I'm talking to you. Okay. I have a question for you.
Yes, sir.
Did James Madison, in his ingenious design of the Constitution, whom you just cited, did he leave room for a constitutional convention?
Yes.
Thank you. Thomas Jefferson, who had a lot to do with the Constitution, did he not say that we need a new Constitution for each generation?
Yes.
So this is entirely consistent with the founding fathers, that we gather together and we ask questions like, does DC, the District of Columbia, deserve representation as well as its taxation? Does Puerto Rico deserve a place in the national conversation? Okay, we need to have a conversation where we can take these questions that the founders actually set us up and designed this Constitution to pursue in order to avoid the question that you avoided, which is the Civil War question. How do we get from where we are in our divided, we've never been, would you agree we haven't been as divided as we were since 1860?
Maybe the 1960s, maybe.
I don't think so. What evidence would you have in the 1960s?
The riots, the political violence. There's a book by Brian Burroughs called Days of Rage, which talks about all of the bombings. There's almost one bombing a day from 1970 to about 1973. We don't have a mass media, and most of the times the bombs don't actually kill people, but there's the Weather Underground. There's a lot of left-wing terrorist organizations that are dropping bombs every day.
And the 1960s were probably the greatest decade of hope. If you listen to pop culture, if you listen to, leaders like Martin King, Robert Kennedy, these are leaders who led with hope and optimism. I suggest that we are in the most dismal period now, because hope is, you talk to young people in terms of their cynicism, their apathy towards the entire, are we close to the halfway? 1 minute, okay. Their cynicism, their apathy in terms of the entire American experiment, I think it exceeds the 1960s by far. Young people in the 1960s believed they could change the world. Young people in the 1960s marched and they got on freedom rides and they did all kinds of things to change the world. Young people now, I don't think have that same kind of sense of optimism. So I'd like to know what we do to avoid, in our last 30 seconds, another civil war.
30 seconds, huh? So we stay true to the Constitution, which is we continue with this technology of stable political change. We elect leaders. We elect people that will do the right thing instead of people that will enrich themselves. But this is on us. The fault is in us, not in the U.S. Constitution.
So I want to pivot now. Okay.
Okay.
So we're in the halfway point. This is exhausting.
I know, it's hard.
Because if you look at voter participation, I think you can see a solution. So I actually agreed with that point while you were making it. I think it is the only hope. If we can raise the level of confidence that people have in our electoral process. So I actually did some reading on this.
While you're looking it up, one thing I didn't say that I wanted to point out was When Jefferson says that the Constitution should be rewritten, he says about every 25 years, about every once a generation. He says, or the earth belongs to the living. And so why should we all of us alive be enthralled to these people that have been dead for hundreds of years? But he writes that in a private letter to James Madison, founder of the Constitution. And Madison says, like, he basically writes back politely, but to paraphrase, like, are you insane? Do you know how hard it was to pass this Constitution? And Madison just has a very classical conservative, so I don't mean conservative in a contemporary sense. He has a classical conservative idea, which is it is a heck of a lot harder to build institutions than it is to tear them down. And if you try and tear down a constitution every 25 years, considering the sinful nature of human beings, that's a recipe for chaos. That's not a recipe for progress. Like, that's Madison's point.
But I don't think he thought it would be 10 times that if we're back in the other role now.
Yeah.
Namely 250 years that this thing would go without any kind of major revision. But to the point of voter participation, as I think about representation and whether or not the Constitution can be saved, it occurs to me that the only grounds on which it can be saved is if citizens in the United States of America stop acting like idiots. And I mean that term in its most literal sense.
I know where you're going.
Yeah. So in the Greek polis, the one who did not participate in public life or in the public square or in public activity or in public affairs or in the civil society was called something like an idiotes or something like that, an idiot, right? So it's a person who's to himself, okay, or to herself. So we have a real crisis of participation, which is why I'm happy to see people in this room here today, because I wish there were more this week here, because I've got 3 stripes on my shoes, and I wore these shoes on purpose because these are the 3 branches of the federal government.
I think that's how Adidas made them. Yeah,
I think that's what they were thinking. Yeah. But I think it was Joe Allen that told me that more Americans can cite the 3 stooges that can cite the 3 branches of the federal government. That's a problem. Okay.
There's a new talking point out that with it, political scientists use. Most people can name more Kardashian children than they can name any of the amendments.
That's crazy. That's insane.
For one, I like it. No, I'm just kidding. The other thing is, if you change the Constitution, but you don't change the culture.
On right now?
Oh, I thought we were just talking without masks.
No. We flipped sides, I thought. Yeah. Pardon? I'm now for. So I'm now saying, thank you, Mr. Provost. Okay.
You caught me off guard.
No. We flipped. I'm for. You're no. You're against now. You're in the con side. So I'm taking up your points, and I'm going to try to take them a little bit down the road. So, for example, participation in primary elections in the United States of America. 80% of Americans don't participate. That's stunning. Of eligible voters. So this is voluntary self-disenfranchisement. That's a problem. That's a crisis. That's where the crisis is. That's where the issue is. The other thing is, we got politicians who are performing because that's what our national appetite is for. We don't have an appetite to actually care about what the issues actually are. So we have politicians who have become expert at performance and at political power politics, and we don't hear much about the policy or the issues. That's our fault. That's the people's. That's we the people's fault. And so I think the kind of revolution that we need, and I mean that in the best sense, is a kind of transvaluation of values with respect to our role as citizens in the United States of America. I could go on. Voter rates in Sweden, 80%. Uruguay, 90%. Belgium, 78%. We're below all of those places in general elections. We're at something like 62%. But we have to demand that those who are in elected office create a system of electoral politics that is accessible, fair, where lines aren't as long as they are. There are ways, there are solutions to this, and where we can regain the trust of the electoral system.
So why the Constitution cannot be is not worth saving in relation to representation. The best set of arguments here goes back to the Anti-Federalists. Do you know who the Anti-Federalists are? It's my Constitution students, I know. The Anti-Federalists are the group of people, some of whom, like Elbridge Gerry and George Mason, were at the Constitutional Convention. They leave the Constitutional Convention and they say, no, this is a fatally flawed document. Why is it fatally flawed? We're going through the ratification debate right now in my class. Anti-Federalists say this might work for a little bit, but what is the Constitution set up to do? It is essentially set up to protect property. So its main point. Then what you are going to have is a massive government that is going to get too big. It is going to be unresponsive to the people. They say people are not going to know who their representatives are, and they're not going to care. People will become apathetic, and that is built into the system. That is built into the idea of the Constitution. You will have a Supreme Court that will eventually adjudicate all major conflicts because Congress is going to be too big. It's going to be too distant from the people. Congress is going to go into gridlock. And then the Supreme Court is going to have to solve every major controversial issue. That's going to raise resentment against the Supreme Court. And I'm not making this up. We just talked about this in class. You are going to get an old, corrupt elite versus a strong man.
Yep.
You are going to get a populist demagogue versus an old, corrupt elite. And that is built into the constitutional structure. That is by design. That's not a defect.
How is that built in? Like, how do you believe? I mean, I know you're quoting Anti-Federalists, but how do you believe that's built in?
Oh, but it's built in despite the best intentions of the founders, the Anti-Federalists say.
So it's built in to lead to a corrupt government.
Yeah.
And
the government's going to grow in size.
The way to reverse that is through...
We need a new constitutional convention.
Because elected people who are elected can't change that?
Not in the current Constitution. Not from the Anti-Federalist point of view.
Oh, not from their point of view.
Oh, and I'm going to agree with them in this instance.
Okay. So it seems to me that all rights are illusory unless voting rights are upheld. Now I'm quoting Justice Black from 1964. Voting is the key way in which we are represented, and it's the key way in which we have a voice. If voting levels are are as low as they are in terms of voter apathy, the problem we have is not only the apathy, the problem we have is the zealotry. You've got these zealots on the one side, and you got most of us who are apathetic. If we can mobilize people who are apathetic to become more involved and get the zealots from running the show, because that's who's running things on both sides. It's these extremists on both sides that are running things. The problem with that argument, and I agree with the Anti-Federalists here, so I'm going to go with them here, which is the idea that how many House reps do we have? How many voting House reps do we have? 435, right? So 435 people are in the House of Representatives, the House that's designed to represent most of the people. How many people do we have in the country? Depending on the census, probably about 330 million, somewhere up maybe upwards of 350 million, depending on how you count it, right? The House of Representatives was a heck of a lot more representative during the founding. Why did we stop it? Because we passed a law. If we kept the original distribution of House reps, there would be thousands of House reps, but there's not anymore. So what does that do when you have one or two House reps representing millions of people? It produces apathy. This is what the Anti-Federalists are saying. It produces people who don't feel connected to their government. But every 10 years.
What do you mean? We stopped. We have stopped it since the early 20th century.
I understand that, but every 10 years, based on the U.S. Census, we redistribute or redesign the districts so that the representation can remain proportional to the United States population.
We shift around House reps. So if like California gets more people, they get more House reps, but we don't expand the number of how, like we don't say, okay, here's a new.
We don't expand the government.
We don't expand the House reps,
which would expand the government.
Yeah.
And you're saying that big government is the problem.
No. This is if you're going to have a representative government, have a representative government.
Which is why every 10 years after the census, we redistribute seats.
No, but you're not producing more representation.
Or more government.
No, you're not producing more representation.
I can't see how producing more people in the House is going to improve our political process. I don't see the connection.
Well, this is
how will that improve our political process?
Well, this was also the same kind of idea, is because the Constitution is flawed in that way.
Yeah, let us know, because I'm really tired of this side. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. You want to reflect on it? Do you really agree with
No, so the federal, I think the anti-federalists are basically wrong about a lot of that. But you have to argue a position, right?
And you really believe that more representatives in the House?
No, it would be even more gridlock.
That'd be a nightmare.
But one thing, I mean, the main point
so you've got a problem. So let's multiply the number of people who are.
The main problem that the anti-federalists have with the U.S. Constitution is the checks and balances are only going to work for a while, and then the wheels are going to come off. And then once the wheels come off, then you're just going to have basically the Supreme Court. They say the Supreme Court's going to basically have to adjudicate every controversial issue. And people are eventually going to lose faith in the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court is not going to always rule on what you want it to be, right? Like that's their main point.
So do you agree that voter participation is the answer to representation?
I think that would probably alleviate quite a bit. Yeah.
Right.
Because, I mean, that's the thing is.
Pardon me, Monique? Got it.
You want to do a quick?
Yeah, a quick religion.
Quick religion.
Religion is the most difficult as we have pondered religion. So both of us agree that our democratic process is dependent on a religious basis. I mean, that's the way the Constitution was designed. So whether or not it was Christian, it was clearly theistic. Even Jefferson, who owns slaves, lives in fear of God about the slaves that he owns.
Yeah.
And he says, justice will not sleep forever.
Yeah.
So he kind of knows there's this kind of overriding kind of sense that there is a God who is sort of undergirding our freedoms in terms of who gives us our freedom at the end of the day, and also kind of marking the way we relate in terms of civil discourse. What do you want to do with this? What do you want to? I think the pro-side concept, we don't have enough time for that.
Okay, let's just kind of go through then.
You want to go through it? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the first idea to note, in the First Amendment, we have the free exercise clause and we have the establishment clause. And so the establishment clause, and I did a lecture for this. I did a lecture on this topic for the Nixon Library. The establishment clause says the state cannot establish a religion, but it says even more. If you read the actual words, it cannot respect this establishment of a religion. So what that means is that the Congress, and that's in the original language, cannot respect any particular religion. And then that is essentially an interdenominational problem that the founders see. Because the founders, there are not enough Jewish Americans for the country to become Jewish. There are not enough Muslim Americans for the country to become Muslim during the founding. But what they are afraid of are different denominational or different Christian traditions taking over. So the Establishment Clause saying we cannot establish or respect an establishment of religion basically means that we are not going to favor one Christian denomination over another Christian denomination. Why might you think that if you've looked at the past 200-300 years of Europe? Because Christians have been killing other Christians in Europe for hundreds of years, right? Okay. The Free Exercise Clause says, okay, you are free to believe what you want, but you are not free to hurt other people because of your beliefs, right? That's the basic kind of idea. The problem comes in when we have the rise of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, the rise of agnosticism, the rise of atheism, and then you start to get this idea that what looks like liberal neutrality, so the government's going to be neutral against when it comes to any religious claim. Liberal neutrality starts to look like secularism, and it starts to look like religious persecution to many Christians. So, for instance, in 1962, there's a Supreme Court decision that says no mandatory prayer in schools. Right? Okay, all right. In 1985, there's the Jaffrey decision, which says it is illegal to have a mandatory moment of silence in public schools, even if it is not devoted to prayer. Just a mandatory, let's have a moment of silence. Let's have 30 seconds of silence at the beginning of each public school day. That is illegal, right? Now, if you go back in time and you think, oh, are we talking about different Christian denominations? That can sound more reasonable. If you look at it in the late 20th century, it suddenly looks like an attack on people of faith. That is a problem. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. So let's deal with the question. Is the Constitution worth saving with respect to religion? Yes or no? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean,
how do you find a way forward if the Constitution is dependent on a kind of religious basis and the majority of people are functioning without a religious basis? If it's about free exercise and the majority of people are no longer freely exercising their faith, what holds together the principles of freedom, of civility, and of our overall culture?
Yeah,
I really mean that. I really mean that as an honest question.
Yeah, no,
I don't mean that as a sort of indictment. In fact, it'd be great to open up the room to that question, because I think that's a problem. That's a crisis.
I think one of the things that makes the Constitution worth saving in that respect is that the Constitution, to quote Winston Churchill on democracy, he says democracy is the worst form of government except all the others. The U.S. Constitution is, a really bad way to try to set up church and state, except for all of the other ones that are really terrible. So if you look at, for instance, Europe, why do you have massive rates of secularization over the course of the last 150 years?
State church.
That's what most scholars will say. They'll say state church, and I agree with them. Because if you intertwine the state and a state religion, when the state messes up, and states will always mess up, a nation state is not perfect, they will not only blame the state, but they will blame that religion. And they become resentful not only of the politicians, but the people who are religious authorities who are also taking their tax money if it's a state religion.
So what is the way forward in our current Constitution to maintain or to address these religious questions?
The Constitution
and its religious dependencies.
Yeah, I think to kind of go back to like what you were saying about a kind of a cultural revolution, a way of talking about voter registration. The Constitution is not a tool to compel religious belief. It was never that,
and it should not.
And it should not be. Yeah,
and that's part of the genius of the United States Constitution.
Yeah,
right.
So I think,
but it was dependent on that as a kind of grounding.
Yeah, John Adams says that our Constitution is wholly inadequate for people that are not religious or moral. He says, and Washington says the same thing. But that is that's on us as citizens. You can't expect the Constitution to solve that type of problem. But I do think it's still the best framework. Look at every other country. I think it's still the best framework as a seed or a background or a necessary condition to revive religion.
So perhaps for people of faith, it's a question of not, you and I talked about the denuding of the public square.
Yeah, the naked public sphere is a word from phrase from Richard John Newhouse.
So it's about people of faith getting more active, like you said about voting, getting more active in terms of putting their faith into action in the public square.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That'd be my sense.
Yeah. I think we're at time.
That was a lot. A lot of masks coming on and being taken off. Thank you. Thank you all. Happy to chat for a minute. Thank you, sir.